Hey, so I've been thinking of doing this episode for a long time in the vein of what I wish I could tell my clients. And so the reason for that is because as a therapist, we're taught very clearly, very early on that we are not to share too much of our own stories with clients because it can interfere with their healing. Too much projection, too much trying to identify all of that stuff. It's just not a good idea to say too often, oh, I did that, or I went through that, or here's my experience. I do it sometimes, but not as often as I sometimes wish I could. So the good news is on this podcast, I am not working with clients. I'm just talking to people. And so I get to say what I want and maybe use it as a platform to, get some messages out there that I wish I could just plainly say. So the feedback I get from listeners also is that the more personal I get with things, the better they are able to sort of hook in and understand it and relate in a way that's helpful. So today we're going to get a little personal as I wonder, can someone thrive in the gray area? Meaning, is there life after loss? So some people could say that my whole life I've known grief. My father died of cancer when I was 4 years old. He got sick when I was 3 years old. And it was a quick year of illness and, trying to live out your last days as best you can. I have no real concrete memories of that time other than, one or two sort of snapshots of being in hospice care with him. And actually, the one vivid memory I have is of getting in trouble jumping on the bed when he was in hospice. He was in an in-person hospice, like in facility, which I don't even think those exist anymore for any length of time. But he was in one of the first ones in Washington, D.C. He was one of the first patients in one of them in Washington, D.C. And they used to take me to visit it. And I would, gleefully, as a 3 or 4 year old might do, run up and try to jump on his bed to greet him and getting reprimanded. I honestly don't remember who. I just remember getting sort of yanked back. I don't know if it was my mom or a nurse or whatever, but because I could hurt him. By that time, it had spread to his bones. So I can't even imagine as an adult now, the terror I must have caused jumping on this poor person's bed when he was in excruciating pain and what damage I could have done had I actually landed on him. So I tell all that story just to tell you that I don't really have any memories of my dad, but I have all the stories and all of the, family folklore that comes after a person goes that I grew up with. So I grew up, with a supportive family, lots of siblings, an amazing mom who, kept him going through stories and through memories and things like that. And also it was the 70s and 80s and nobody really knew anything about grieving or how to grieve or the mental health that's supposed to happen. So it was one of those just, we locked that shit down and we moved on with our lives. And so I had the first hand experience of living after loss, but I didn't really learn how to grieve or how to mourn or what life could be like after something like that. Fast forward to when I'm barely an adult myself. I'm around my 31st birthday, I think. My mother also died of cancer. Good times, right? I had just had my second child, so she wasn't even around for my third child. I had spent my whole life with just her, really. My siblings are much older than I am, so she and I kind of grew up together, if you will, after my dad died. And so we were pretty tight. Not that it's ever easier or harder to lose your mother. Losing a parent is losing a parent, but it was at a really horrible time for me in the sense that I was newly learning how to be a mom. I was kind of newly learning how to be an adult, and being a mom without a mom is an entirely new and different type of grief. You don't have anybody to ask your questions. You don't have anybody to share the experience with. You don't have anybody to hold your history. At that point, having lost both parents, I didn't have anybody anymore who knew me young or who knew my family young or my family from before or my family history. Yes, I have all these siblings, but when you lose the sort of matriarch of it, it gets tricky. It gets tricky, that kind of stuff. That's some of the stuff that comes into grief that nobody really warns you about, is that you've lost your family medical history, for instance. All I know is that my parents died of cancer. I don't know what surgery she had when she was younger or what my dad was diabetic, I think. I don't know. I go to the doctor and I'm reminded every time, nobody holds the history of my family anymore because they're gone. So, and in addition, it was a little bit delayed for me, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but the grief was a little delayed because, like I said, I had just had a second baby. We had moved. My husband had a new job. We were living actually in my in-laws' basement at the time that my mother died because we were moving into a new house and we had sold the house we had just come from. So there was like a million things happening in my life. And I didn't know, I was at a new job. I didn't know that I wasn't grieving fully, but I figured it out a few years later when I wasn't as distracted by other life events, and it really kind of hit me hard, the loss that I had suffered. I'll get into that in a bit, but the most recent loss, and all along the way, peppered in here, I've lost really good friends to various different ailments. I have lost other relatives. We have, some close, some not so close that we've said goodbye to. And so I just feel like I'm somebody who knows death, if that sounds a little creepy, but it's the truth. My life has sort of walked hand in hand with grief and loss. Most recently, I lost my sister, and that's been a really different experience too, because for all of the obvious reasons, she was the oldest. She was the keeper of our family history. She was the person left after my mom died to be, the mother figure to me. She and I both had kids. And so she was the person I could call and sort of be a peer with as far as parenting goes. But she also wasn't a peer. She was 20 years older than I am. So it was kind of like I had this substitute parent in a way that when I lost mine. But it's been a really different experience afterward because I find myself much more angry. First of all, she was young. Second, she had, a lifelong illness. And so that's unfair. And I find myself every time something happens that I think she would have really loved or really gotten a kick out of, I get like pissed off that she's not here for it. For everything from, women in sports, she was a trailblazer, a Title IX trailblazer, my sister, and women have had such a year this year in sports, in the Olympics and women's basketball and all of the things. And I just find myself like angry that she doesn't get to be part of that. And, so from something as sort of little and global as that to her kid getting married, her not being there, like that's a whole cacophony of emotions in that you are thrilled for this human and was a day full of love and joy and wonder and all of the things. And also, I'm pissed off that she's not there and I'm sad for her partner and, all of it just stinks. So that kind of is where I am with grief lately. I'm feeling surrounded about it again and almost like open to my entire life history of it. I've really dug into it with my professional work because trauma it's just part of it. Grief is often, even if it's not a traumatic loss, the grief, especially if it's a childhood loss or something like that, can mimic that trauma response and the way that our bodies and minds kind of move forward with things. And I've gotten really passionate, I think, about helping people live through and thrive after loss. Because I think what I've seen is so many people mistake grief for this thing that you do and then you get over and you move through or you move past or you move out of or whatever. Or it's a thing that you're never going to move through or move past or moved out of. So there's these real extremes of like, life goes on after I get over this, or I'm never getting over this. So life feels like it can't go on. And I have learned both personally and professionally, there's this messy middle part of those two extremes where, you actually don't ever totally get over it. You don't. Like, I'm never going to get over losing my family members. I'm never going to get over the death of one of my good friends. I'm never going to not miss those people. And I can also experience great joy and great wonder and live really fully in my life. I don't have to wait for some change in my feelings to truly live. And I think my nephew's wedding was kind of a personal, example of that. Here we all were, this family who had just experienced such a devastating loss, celebrating together because there's room for that too. And we wanted that for him. We knew obviously he was missing his mother, but we also knew like this is a wonderful day and we want it to be that way for him. And And we did, we made sure of that. And we were able to hold her with us, but also be able to celebrate what was right in front of us too. And I think that for me was sort of the solidifying moment of like, this is what I want to do professionally. I want to help people have these kind of moments, understand that it is possible to thrive in the darkness and alongside the darkness maybe, or thrive within the gray areas of not quite heals, but also, moving through day to day, to recognize the wonder in the weeds, if you will. It's there and it's yours for the taking. So I'm going to kind of break it down a little bit into like what sucks about this, what I do about it, and what happens when those things are part of it. So the what sucks part, first of all, it's just unfair. Like, these are the things I wish I could say out loud to people when they're sitting with me and they've experienced some sort of loss. Like, it's unfair. It's unfair. And so if you're mad or you think it's unfair or you're frustrated that this thing happened, that's totally normal, acceptable, and part of the whole process. I don't buy into all of the phases and stages because that somehow makes it seem like there's a proper way to grieve. And that's BS, if you ask me. I understand it. I understand we like to order things, and it can be helpful sometimes to think like, oh, I'm in this phase of it. Totally fine. I get it. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you like how it's supposed to be done or how it follows an order. And because that would assume it follows an order. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't. At least for me, it hasn't. But part of it, I think for everybody universally, is that anger, that feeling of like, this isn't fair the way this happened. And it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter if they were, 25 or 85. There is a part of losing someone that just isn't fair, that you should have to feel this bad. It's not fair. Also, it can be complicated. Grief can be complicated. The loss can be complicated. Your relationship might have been complicated. I always think it's really funny with my own mom. I said, you don't have anybody when you lose a mom as a mom, you don't have anybody to call and say like, what's happening here? Or how did you handle this? Or what did you feel like? I don't know for those of you not watching, I'm holding up a phone like it's 1990. Nobody does this anymore, but you know what I mean? You don't have anybody to reach out to and ask. And yes, that is true. And that is sad. And also in my own personal experience, she was never very good at that anyway. So it's actually not that I'm missing that, because she probably would have just made me feel bad for like complaining or, not being able to do it as easily as she did it, or, that kind of thing. Like, she was a great person, but she had some moments where you're like, gosh, this is the most judgmental human. And so the fact that I say like, oh, I don't have anybody to call and ask about these things is kind of ironic, because I probably either wouldn't have, or I would have called her and she wouldn't have made me feel better anyway. So that's what I mean by complicated. Sometimes we feel like we're missing something when in reality, that isn't the thing that we would have had, even if they were still here. Yet it's still okay to feel like, man, I wish I had the opportunity at least, because I sure would much rather have a call with my mom where she made me feel bad about something than not have one at all. So it's weird and complicated. And sometimes there's a sense of guilt over living your life, or guilt over moving on, or guilt for thinking like what I just said. It's taken me a long time to be realistic about my parents, because when you lose somebody, you think, well, I can't talk bad about them. Like, I can't admit that my mom was actually not really supportive about certain parenthood things, because, women of a generation sometimes aren't that way. They're sort of like, I don't know, we just got it done. What are you complaining about? It took me a long time to say that out loud without feeling guilty about it, without feeling guilty about admitting that like she wasn't perfect. And same with my dad. I barely knew the guy, but I had him, he was like up on a pedestal my whole life. And I got to a point where, I'd hear some stories and be like, of my siblings, like stories from my siblings. And I'd be like, well, that kind of stinks. Like, maybe he wasn't so perfect after all. And there can be some guilt around that, the guilt around sort of speaking ill of the dead kind of thing. And that sense of loss over something that maybe didn't actually exist, that's hard. And the guilt over like your own life being okay and fine and thriving through it can sometimes be tricky too. And that's something to be navigated as you go. It's also hard. And I really want to acknowledge that like there's a hole that's never filled. And I'm not saying it doesn't like close over a little. And I'm not saying that you're not going to feel better ever, but there isn't anything that takes the place of the person. There isn't anything that fully sort of scabs over. There isn't meaning, I guess. What I mean is there doesn't come a time where you feel fine about losing someone. And I choose that word purposefully because I think we use that a lot. And I think our expectations sometimes are, well, I'll start living again or I'll start thriving again when I don't feel bad ever. And I think to expect that you're never going to feel bad again about this monumental loss is unfair to you, to think that it's ever going to come a time where you don't feel it anymore. And I don't say that to be disheartening, because there might be some of you sort of in the early days of grief where you're like, oh my God, is she saying I'm never going to stop feeling like this? And that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about thriving after loss. I fully understand that doesn't happen right away. In those early days, weeks, months, years for some people, it's just a heavy, heavy sadness. And it makes it sometimes seem impossible that anything's ever going to feel good again. And I'm here to tell you that it is going to feel good again, and that you're never going to fully lose the sadness or the empty hole that person left in your heart. So again, there's no absolutes in this. There's no getting over it fully, and there's no going back to like the way you felt before it happened. You know, because I lost a parent so young and because I was raised by a widow, I think I had this weird understanding that I was going to be prepared for my mother's death. I always had like a little bit of an inkling that it was going to happen when I was young, and that we were sort of on borrowed time. Oh, I should mention my mother's she was 43 when she had me. So for most of my, not childhood, but like my high school and college years, there was something going on. She had to have this surgery or that surgery, or she broke a leg, or she was kind of like old before. I don't want to say that either, because she was working till literally the day she died. So like she was this vibrant woman, but had a lot of health stuff come up. Nothing major in the early days, but she was first diagnosed with cancer when I was 20. And then they took care of it. And, we had 10 years before it came back again. But for sure, from 20 on, I sort of thought like, okay, the clock is ticking. And I made some choices and I did some things in my life that definitely were about getting it done before I lost my mom. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it. I'm not saying that's healthy. I am saying I had to go back and sort of look at that and realize that a lot of the way that I was living my life was in this, like, if you only have 180 days to live, what do you do? But except it wasn't me, it was her. If I only get her for a little bit more time, what do I want to do before she's gone? And that wasn't healthy either. And so going back, I didn't want to go back to that, but I kind of did. It was almost like, okay, how do I now prepare myself? I wasn't prepared for this. I thought I was going to be prepared. And in my mind, prepared meant fine. I'll be fine when she dies. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but I'm just being honest with you. That's what I was thinking. Oh, you've already lost a parent. Also, you have like sucked the marrow from the bone of this relationship. And so you'll be fine when it's over because you've done everything you want to do. You've planned, you've gotten married, you've had some babies, she's seen it all, you've graduated, you've got a master's degree, like all the things. I did all the things and she was there for all the things. And so I thought it would be less hard. That's utter craziness. And I fell right into that trap. So I didn't necessarily want to go back to that way of living because I didn't want to keep living as if I was on borrowed time, because I also realized, well, that doesn't help anything. So there isn't any getting over it. There certainly isn't any planning for it, like I thought. And there really isn't any going back to the way things were before. That said, there is moving forward in a way that can be healthy and happy and slightly less burdened than you feel in those early days, weeks, months after a loss. I talked a little bit about how my mourning with my mom, my grief with my mom was a little bit delayed. And really, it was just like I was numb for a while because I was so distracted by the new house and the new baby. And then we moved and and then I had another baby and then all of these things. So these like life events kept happening. And in those early days and weeks, you get distracted by, we got to get the death certificates and we got to close the accounts and we got to pay the bills off and we got to sell the house and we got to move. I had a sister that lived with her and we had to figure out where she was going to go and like all these things. You just get sort of caught up in the not minutia, because it's not big, small stuff, but in the like day-to-day tasks and like year-to-year tasks of stuff can be really distracting in the early days of death and weeks, months of death. And then also my own life was distracting because I had babies and, a life to live and a new marriage and a new house and all of that stuff. So it wasn't until like probably 5 years later. So, the baby that was born when she was sick was 5. And then I had another baby and we moved out of state and we weren't near any family at all. And I shouldn't say that. We weren't near any of my family at all. My husband has family all over the place where we live, but I wasn't close to any of them. And there's something different about your parent anyway. Even if you're close to a million cousins and aunts and uncles, it's not your mom. So I was in this new place. He was working all the time. I just felt really lonely. And that translated to I'm utterly alone. Now, mind you, I am not. At that point, I had 5 siblings. And, my husband has siblings and my in-laws are outstanding. They're so wonderful and they've been so wonderful to me. But I felt very alone and the whole weight of it hit me at one time. And I was a mess for, a couple months. I was all the stuff that you sometimes are right at the beginning. I was angry and irritable and distractible and my cognition wasn't really proper. And, I was just kind of going through the motions of my day. And at this point, it was so far beyond the death that I thought, well, maybe I'm just depressed or maybe I have anxiety or maybe there's something else going on. And it took me a little bit of time to recognize like, oh, this is grief. It just took me a bit. And I'm going to move into the next spot of like, well, what do I do with that? How have I learned to thrive in this area? And I'm going to move into the next because one of the things that happened was Grey's Anatomy. And, I had little kids at the time, so I didn't get a lot of television time. But for some reason, I always was able, probably because it felt like it was always on some channel, Grey's Anatomy at that point. I was able to tune in, and it was right around the time in the series, if you've ever watched it, where Meredith is going through all the stuff with her mom getting sick and having Alzheimer's and dying and sort of reconciling like their relationship and losing her and blah, 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 blah. And there was an episode. It wasn't even Meredith at the time. I think it was just another like random patient that died. The mother died. And I cried at this television show like I have never cried about anything in my entire life, including the death of these parents. Like never cried like this. The like heaving, like you think it's never going to end, that kind of crying. And that was kind of the moment where I realized like, oh, this is grief. Cause like I can't possibly be this sad about this woman on television. But I think what this is it feels like it's a familiar scene in the hospital room with your mom. And like it looked like my experience, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I was missing her and I was alone and I was just in agony. And that happened frequently, not in the grocery store or not whatever, but I would then start to almost plan, like, let me watch this show. Like I recognized the shows that were going to elicit that kind of response from me. And it was almost therapeutic. Like, okay, if I can watch this show where something so catastrophic happens that I'm forced to cry like this, it's like allowing me a PS, not that my family would have cared at all if I had just done that, but the TV show was a good cover. And it allowed me to really just get into that depth of sadness that I maybe wouldn't have allowed myself otherwise. So that's one thing that I still continuously do, is not only like, not regularly, but I have those really good moments of sad where you're just like, yeah, let it come in, let it wash over, let it come. Because I'm not afraid that it's going to take over. And I'm not afraid to let it in for fear that I can never get it out. I know like these are things that need to come and go and move through and wash over. And I learned that sort of by doing it. I think we all know that, but it doesn't feel, sometimes what we know and what we feel are not the same thing. And so it's not that I, had this great understanding of that. It was more like, well, I did it a couple times and then I was okay the next day, or I could take care of my kids, or I could even be fine later that evening. Like it was really just this, okay, my body needs to release some of the sadness and this is the way that's going to do it. I also didn't hide that from my children. One of the things my mom didn't get right, and I totally understand why she did it, But she was never really sad about my dad around me. I have one very distinct memory of being in church during a Lenten service. For those of you who are not Christian or Catholic, I should say, I'm not Christian. You go to a couple services before Easter Mass and they're sad because you're, remembering that our Savior was killed. And so the songs are sad and the mood is generally sad. And we were at one of them, and there is a song, a pretty popular Catholic song, and it started, and I can remember she had on, it must have been fairly close to when he died. So maybe I was 6 or 7 or something, because in my memory, she is beautiful and thin. And she was always beautiful, but she wasn't always thin. And so thin was close to his death. And she had on a long camel colored trench coat because it was still freezing around Easter time. And I just remember, like, my memory is her grabbing my hand and like yanking me out of the pew, and her coat like flying behind us. Like we beat it out of that church so fast, her coat was flying behind. And it was because she started crying. And that was not okay. She was not going to cry in public. She was not going to cry in front of me. She was not going to have any of it. I still, to this day, that song, I can hear like the first note, because it's like a funeral song. It's an Easter song. We hear it all the time. I immediately tear up and cry, because I realized, like, that was the one time, I used to hear her crying in her bedroom at night when she thought we were all sleeping, but she never allowed that sadness in. And I then learned that, like, it wasn't okay to be sad. Like, you couldn't acknowledge the sadness that so obviously comes from losing somebody. I didn't do that with my kids. They saw me cry, and one of them, it made them very uncomfortable. My middle kid from birth has been very uncomfortable when I cry. And I'm convinced it's because that was the one that was born when my mother was sick. Like, that child came into my life almost like a rescue balm. Like, they were not only distracting, but they just had this personality, even as a baby, that was very much like, what can I do for you? They are not like that now. But as a baby, it was very much like, I'm here for you. I'm here to be calm, and I'm here to be quiet, and I'm here to snuggle you and love on you and be worried about you. And I wanted to make sure that was not a thing that they actually had to do. And so when I cried, even though it made them uncomfortable, I would just say, like, yeah, I'm either happy or sad, because I cry all the time. So, like, I'm either happy or, like, yeah, I'm sad, I'm missing so-and-so, or like, I wish they could be here. And it would just be that simple. Like, I'm feeling this thing right now, and this is how my body is doing it. And that's that. Let's move on from it, kids. Like, you don't need to make me feel better. And it's okay that I feel this way. I don't need to feel better right now. I need to just feel this right now. So that's a thing that I did. Not only did I allow in the sadness, but I allowed everybody else to know that it was happening. I didn't shield anybody from the sad that is inevitable after you lose somebody, including years later. Like, my friends where I live now, they don't even know my mom, because I moved here well after she died. And so not a single person that knows me in my adult life where I have raised my children knows my mother. They don't know my mother. They barely know my family, but they definitely don't know my mother. And yet I bring her up. I talk about, what she was like, and I talk about what it's like to not have her anymore. And I can remember my daughter was in a fashion show they used to do in 8th grade. They did this comportment fashion show, and she was in it. And I remember thinking, and she did know my mom. She was alive when my mom, she was alive for a couple of years when my mom was alive. And they had a very sweet relationship, because she was the first granddaughter and the first, girl in the second part of my mom's life. She had all girls herself, and they just had this cute relationship. And I really think that they would have been good friends had my mom stayed alive. Like, I think they would have enjoyed each other's sort of creativity and sass and everything else. And so this fashion show came, and my girl looked like, she looked like my mom. Like, she just looked very classy and, fancy. And I looked around, and everybody else was there with their parents, and they had, all the grandparents were in the front rows and everything else. And I just was like, this stinks. Like, I'm sad that she's not here. And I kind of let everybody know that, including my girl. And that goes with the other thing that I did, which was also to really intentionally and mindfully absorb the good stuff. So while I was having this moment of like, this stinks that my mom doesn't get to see my girl do this, I also was really present for like, how amazing is this day? How fun is this to see her in all her glory up there, walking the catwalk? And I really have probably since that time, 5 years after my mom died, when I realized how lonely and sad I was, probably since then, I have really made it a mission of my life to soak up the good stuff and to really take it all in, not because I'm on borrowed time like before, not because I'm trying to get it all in before someone dies, but because it's honoring them. It's honoring the people that I've lost. They don't get to see all this stuff. So I'm really going to make sure I love getting to see it. And that's the other thing I do is really I celebrate their lives. My kids know my parents. They know the family history. They know my sister. I mean, they knew her anyway. They were alive, for most of her life, but I mean, she was around for a lot of their lives, but also like I tell other stories about how the two of us, were before they were born and how, they just, I keep them in our stories and in our home and in our family as much as I can. And that helps me. And also it helps me because then they know them too. And that's really important to me. So that's why it sucks. That's what I do. People always say like, look for the silver lining, or are there any upsides? And that actually makes me angry because no, of course there are no upsides to losing someone. There is no silver lining to someone's death. Might there be some things that happen that surprise you in their positivity? Sure. I will tell you the one thing about me that has come from this that isn't so bad is that I am not afraid to be vulnerable. Once I worked through that anxiety of, oh my God, I got to do all the things before I lose these people because what happens if I lose them? I realized I have been through the worst and I'm okay. And so I am okay being vulnerable in the sense that I will allow love in, I will allow joy in, I will allow happiness in because I know I'll be okay and I know it's worth it. The loss, the sadness, the things that happen when something is taken away or when somebody dies or when you lose something that you loved, that loss is worth how good everything feels if you allow it in to begin with. So there are no upsides. There are no silver linings. But a positive thing that I might not have had otherwise is this openness to living and loving, knowing that the fear of losing it all is minuscule compared to the depth of how good it is in the moment. So when I wonder, can you thrive right alongside grief, right alongside loss? I know the answer is yes. It doesn't happen right away, and it is not always easy, and it is certainly not a straight line, but you can do it. Trust me, I've been doing it for 40 some years. All right, that's all I got. Thanks for listening.